Hey there, welcome back to the Flex Diet podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. And today I've got a great discussion with my buddy Jaymes Longstrom. He is a coach with Dr. Layne Norton over at Biolayne. He did his bachelor's in exercise science from Concordia University here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he did his master's work for a Master's of Science in Exercise Science from the University of South Florida, working under my good friend Dr. Bill Campbell in the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory. So I got to see Jaymes again recently at the ISSN conference. He was there helping Dr. Layne Norton present a case study. So it was always great to talk with him, and I thought it would be awesome to get him on the podcast. And we talk everything here from coaching to body comp to a little bit of performance. I talked about his poster that he presented as a female competitor. I think it was in physique, I believe, or fitness. I'd have to double check on that at ISSN. And it was really interesting because they've collected a ton of data that they will be presenting more about what happens with physique competitors who are trying to get really, really lean. And they've got data from both males and females. And while this may not be your goal to step on stage in your underwear, maybe it is, but it gives us really good insight on the extremes ends of the spectrum for body comp. And I always believe that the extremes inform the means, as the saying goes. If we have a good idea of what's happening on the extreme, we can then apply some of those concepts to where people are at, kind of more in the mean. Unfortunately, the other way doesn't really work so well. The means don't really seem to inform the extremes. As always, this is brought to you by the Flex Diet certification, which will open again, depending upon when you're listening to this, coming up July 19th, 2021. So be sure to get on the wait list before then or hop on during the time. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. And the certification walks you through 8 different interventions, from protein to sleep to micronutrition, intermittent fasting, and much more. And it's set up in a way that you understand the big picture, the context of how all these concepts and interventions work together. And then there's a deep dive about 1 hour in each one. So for example, on the protein section, everything you wanted to know about how does protein work in your body, from amino acids going into muscle protein synthetic response, breakdown, and all the other components, but it's condensed into, I got all of them down except for the carbohydrate one, into less than an hour. And all of it is fully referenced. And at the end of each intervention, there's 5 specific action items. So as a coach, you'll know exactly what you would need to do with clients. So it's made very actionable, and we walk you through the entire system of how to do that. So this way you are starting with the big rocks. For example, sleep is rated number 8 just because it is high physiologic component, but very low in terms of client ability to change. So the coaching leverage for that is actually quite low. And you'll realize this whenever you've had conversations with clients about their sleep. Right now, I'd rather kind of pound my head through a wall. So it's lined up so that all your higher priority items, both for a physiologic and psychologic impact, are ranked first. So check it out. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. Thank you so much, and enjoy this kind of wide-ranging conversation with Jaymes Longstrom. Hey, what's going on? I'm here with Jaymes Longstrom, who's a coach down in Tampa, Florida, working with Layne's company, Biolayne. So welcome, Jaymes. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I've listened to a few of your past episodes, and you've had a
Oh,
long list of experts, I would say, on here. So I'm very honored to be on.
thank you so much. Yeah, we always get to usually chat at ISSN or sometime when I'm down there when you're working in Dr. Bill Campbell's lab. So it's
Hmm.
always fun to chat and nerd out. So I figured it would be fun to do it again on the podcast.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like I've been to about three or four of those ISSN conferences now. Mostly started going when I started my graduate program at USF, and every time I've been there, we've had a chance to talk and just nerd out a little bit over metabolic rate and body weight changes and stuff like that. So it's always been a pleasure.
Yeah, so for people who may not know you, and I'd recommend they check out your Instagram. You've got very good
Hmm.
research base, but also very practical stuff on Instagram. We'll put the link in here too. Yeah, just give us the short rundown on yourself.
Yeah, so currently I am working under Lane Norton with his company Biolayne, and Holly Baxter, I guess Holly Norton now that they're married. So coaching part-time, and then also we are working on developing a research review. So I'm kind of coordinating that for his new website when that is ready to launch, hopefully this year. We've had a number of different setbacks with web development and just taking longer than usual.
You're kidding. A web
So
development setback never happens. There's never any technical
yeah.
issues with stuff.
No, yeah. If that could actually run at the pace you would want to, it'd be great. But yeah, there's always little things creeping up and giving us issues. So hopefully this year, I think we've been working on it a couple of years now, so we do have some reviews kind of stocked up and ready to go and stuff. And then just refining all that stuff and making sure it appears the way we want to on the site. So yeah, so part-time kind of doing the research review stuff, part-time coaching, and then I'm also keeping my foot in the actual research with what Dr. Bill Campbell's doing over at USF. Kind of another, I guess, aspect or area of his research. We are looking at bodybuilding case studies, which is what I did my research project on for my graduate program. So we kind of continued that, and we're currently working on publishing another case study on a pretty high level female physique competitor. So yeah, it's been great kind of just staying in the research at all. Everything I'm doing is really kind of supportive of one another with coaching, writing the review, and then keeping my foot involved in research as much as I can.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Bill's just a super nice, very knowledgeable, but yet very humble, just wonderful
Oh,
dude all around. So,
yeah. I mean, he's one of the nicest guys you could probably meet in this field, and as humble as he is, it's crazy. I think he's definitely like one of the more underrated kind of active researchers
oh yeah.
within exercise science and stuff, and he's just so humble. It's amazing. So yeah, he's been so I've been fortunate to be able to have an opportunity to work under him and continue my involvement in his lab a little bit.
Yeah, and it's been cool. I've had the luxury of knowing Bill for quite a while now, and just to see his lab grow and to see him actually being able to do more research on, competitive athletes, bodybuilding, physique, and to be able to kind of steer everything in that direction has been super cool because there's not a lot of researchers that are, I would say, able to do it. I think there's a lot that want to do it, but at the end of the day, it has to be practical and someone's got to pay the bills and there's a bunch of other things in the background to make it a reality.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that people often overlook with like research. They'll see a study published and, somebody's got to pay for that. And, if we're lucky, we can maybe pay subjects for research, but oftentimes, with, especially at USF, it's a little bit different there with how their lab is set up and Dr. Campbell's lab is set up. So he's really works hard to get the funding needed to conduct these research studies and do it in a practical manner where they can be very transferred to the general public and people looking to optimize their body composition. So, yeah, I think the behind the scenes work is really underrated, but people don't always get to see that either. So,
Yeah, another aspect of that I think people forget too is that the cost and even just the staff, because one of the things when I would say it's a correct criticism that, maybe the training wasn't supervised, maybe they didn't work directly with a coach or a dietitian as much. But to make those things happen and to have people do all their sessions that are supervised, that are in one area, that are talking to a coach and everything is being tracked and they're talking to the people in the study, like the one study he just ran on a daily basis or even more, that's incredibly time and personnel intensive to make it happen. And I think it's good when it does, but I think a lot of times it's easy for people who don't have any research experience to be like, oh, well, they just didn't do any of this, this, or that. And there's usually a reason why they didn't do certain things. So,
Yes, exactly. It's so common. It's like, well, why didn't they check this and look at this? And it's like, it's not that easy. Like you're stretched usually with any study that is being published. Like researchers are stressed with time. Like you said, a lab team to be able to conduct stuff like that, resources. It's not always feasible. So yeah, it's easy to criticize studies for that, but it's also people need to understand that there's a lot more that goes into it, and there's a rationale for everything, and they probably thought about that before they did. So
yeah, and making it practical too, because everyone's like, oh, well, it was only an 8 or 12 or 16-week study. It's like, okay, yes, of course, as a armchair researcher, I would love to see longer studies and more in depth, but having run studies, you're also weighing how long, even if everything goes well, you don't want people to drop out. Right. So if you have people and you don't know their motivation level when you set everything up and you're going to do a 16-week study and it's pretty intense training, man, if you have a higher dropout rate, you then may not even have statistics to even freaking publish the study without trying to enroll more people. And that ends up having other issues. And so you're always kind of weighing these things, I think, in the background too, because it's like, well, if no one's really looked at this before, maybe I'll go only 12 weeks because I don't want to risk having people drop out. And yeah, so things like that that are easy to criticize, but in the reality, you want to get it done and get it published or else nobody even knows anything about
it. Exactly. And I think the big thing too, especially at USF, I guess, with how that program is set up, we operate on semester basis. So It's like, okay, we come up with an idea. Now we have, X amount of time to get it even accepted or approved by the IRB. And then that's half of the time within that study anyway. So now it's like, if you want to do a dieting study, it would be great to do it for 16, 20 weeks. But the reality is you have maybe 8 to 12 if you're lucky. And so you have to get it done then. And then recruiting enough subjects is a nightmare. And then half it, the attrition rate is terrible with some of those dieting studies. So it's always tough. It's like, you can't just give them food. We don't have the money to do that. And so you lose, 20% of your subjects, and now you're left with barely enough to do the stats. Like you said, it's a lot of challenges that are often really overlooked if you haven't been in the research realm and done anything in the lab.
Yeah. My last comment on that too is that everyone wants more advanced athletes or elite athletes. And so the running joke I had when I was at the University of Minnesota, I'm good friends with Cal Dietz there. If I went over to Cal and I said, hey, Cal, I want to steal like your top athletes and I want to take them for 12 weeks. Oh, they're not going to do your training or your coaching. I want to have a control group that's going to do something like this. And I want the experimental group to do this. He'd be like, go screw yourself. Right? Because his job, like his livelihood, why he's paid by the university is to get results in the safest manner. It's not to help me run a study. As much as it would be great and it would be super interesting, the reality is how everything is set up, even at a collegiate level, it's just not set up for some grad student to go screw around with a bunch of D1 athletes.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the bodybuilding stuff. Getting high-level competitors, it's like they don't want any, researcher or somebody else telling them to follow a specific diet. Like implementing experimental protocols is almost impossible, which is why we've kind of focused on some of these case studies and just observing and exploring those aspects of the bodybuilding literature. So yeah, it's tremendously difficult.
Yeah, and that was kind of my solution, which I think is more practical, is to get a little bit away from quantitative studies and actually do more qualitative studies. Right, so I tried this proposal and it went nowhere, but someone will do it, I think. Would be like if you're working with, high-level bodybuilders or you've got a group of athletes at whatever university, just take a research student and just throw them over there for like a quarter, and your goal is just to do a qualitative study of like, what did you observe and what did you find? Again, it's not a quantitative study. We're not doing any experiment. I get it. But even something on that level, I would argue that we just don't have much data at all, right? And then if someone wants to read that and go, oh, wow, they did this and looks like we may observe this, and run another, maybe a quantitative study off the back of that, But that way you're observing, you're learning stuff, and you're not screwing with what they're doing either. So it actually makes it practical.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, it's nice to have those studies because you can get so many more details
Yep.
and measures conducted on that one person. And then, hopefully it can be translated into a larger quantitative study, like you said. But just seeing, maybe you pick up on certain trends or associations that maybe there's something that we should look into. And I think that's kind of where the value could lie in some of these more qualitative case studies. It's almost like pilot testing, where you can do a lot of different things and see where that larger scale study could go if it's possible.
Yeah, and I think even and people shit on case studies all the time, but in the land of really not much documented data, like case studies, I think are still useful, right? Because that, again, it's not a meta-analysis. I get it. It's not an experimentally controlled study. You don't have multiple subjects. However, you're starting somewhere, right? And when you don't have much of any data on, high-level athletes, a case study is usually more than what you had before.
Right. And you're using objective measures. So
Right.
you can really say, this person dropped X amount of body fat and they also lost X amount of fat-free mass with that. So, maybe that could, again, get done into a larger scale study. And then you look at interventions and experimental, trials. But at the same time, you need that foundation to figure out where to look first and really try to set some expectations for other competitors, and then also hopefully further research, in the future. But yeah, looking at the case studies is nice because you can really have an objective insight into what's occurring, and then maybe looking at the experiments later on. But
Yeah, and I think case studies also, it's the old saying, the extremes inform the means, but the other way
mm,
doesn't work, right? The means don't necessarily inform the extremes. So when I was doing my master's, there's a lot of people who went to work for the automotive industry because I was actually in the mechanical engineering department. And the interesting part that I didn't understand at that point was that I'm like, okay, if you're these big, large motor companies, why would you spend, if you're Ferrari, why would you spend tons of money on F1 racing? Yeah, I get there's a mystique to it and there's all the cultural aspects and everything, but you're talking like hundreds of millions of dollars, high-end auto companies spend on racing. But then you realize a lot of that technology kind of transfers down into everyday vehicles too.
mhm.
So I think they could argue that it may not be profitable per se, but I think if you're really trying to push the edges, you'll learn stuff there that you wouldn't learn if you're only looking at the means all the time. So I think you can learn
Yeah.
stuff from the extremes and kind of transfer them into the means. And in the physique world, like case studies are ways of just showing that, hey, look, this thing did happen. It was possible. Oh wow, someone did get really lean and their resting metabolic rate didn't drop to 500 calories per day. Like some of these weird things that still float around the land of the internet.
Yeah, and the thing with Dr. Campbell's lab and what he really tries to do is when we look, the way that he puts it, and I'm not going to put it as eloquently as he does, but physique athletes are experts at fat loss. Like that is their
Oh yeah.
job to reduce fat mass as much as possible. So if we can look and see kind of what are they doing or what kind of changes are taking place and then transfer that into, more what he likes to call physique minded or physique centered individuals who just want to look better, have a better body composition. What can we take from them and implement into the research for those people that maybe can turn into actual, strategies or approaches that can help them reduce their fat mass. So
Yeah, totally. And I believe you presented at ISSN. We chatted about a case study on a physique competitor female, correct? I think we can say her name,
yes,
but
yeah. So what? Yeah, it's so what we're looking at with that one, and that's the one that we're kind of we are finishing looking at the data now. We've done so many measures with that, so I'm trying to remember what exactly we presented on. I think we just presented on like resting metabolic rate and body composition changes.
right.
So we should have her over like a year span or more because she also participated in my research project, which was more of a case series because there was like 7 subjects in it. So then we continued to follow her through another competition and another competitive season. She actually did 2 competitions, and we did a ton of different. I mean, the hormones we did are crazy. We did so many different hormones. We did a pretty interesting thing with muscle thickness measures and doing like a so with Skinfold, you'll do like usually 7 sites in the research world and get a global measure of body fat percentage. And so what we did is we took I think it was 9 sites of muscle thickness measurements on her. And so we can kind of get a cumulative total of muscle mass based on muscle thickness. So we're looking at that, which really hasn't been done, which will be interesting to kind of see what the results are showing in terms of how much muscle has she lost over that competitive season. And then also looking at nutrition stuff. What did she do for nutrition? A few psychometrics are in there as well. So we really tried to get every measure we could. And, oftentimes that's the best way to go, but then you're left with so much data, it's almost overwhelming. So we're kind of teasing through that now and working on writing up the manuscript.
And then the local measurements, was that ultrasound, or was it just kind of old school like skin calipers, or what did you do for that?
For the muscle thickness?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did B mode ultrasound. So
Okay.
actually measuring the muscle thickness of her sites, and again, it was 9 sites. I forget off the top of my head which ones exactly, but just a good global measure. And it has been done. I think it was Abe. Man, I forget which year it was, but he looked at a bunch of younger males and did this. You can actually take those muscle thickness measurements and put it into a formula, kind of like Jackson Pollock Siri type thing. But it's a little bit different, and it's in, I think, younger Japanese males, so it wouldn't translate into a female per se. But we are going to use that formula and look at kind of like a global muscle mass quantity and compare that between competitions. So.
And would you be able to get fat mass off of that then too, or are you just looking at muscle?
Yeah, we're just looking at muscle with that particularly. You could do, fat thickness with B mode
Right.
ultrasound, but we're going to rely on, we also did Skinfold and A mode ultrasound for body fat percentage. So we'll use that for the actual body fat, which, it's kind of tough, like having all these different measures and then comparing them to one another, and they don't always add up perfectly, because of their level of error rates associated with them. But so we'll use either probably A mode ultrasound for fat mass, and then we'll also have fat-free mass with a 2-component model for that, but then use a B mode ultrasound and look at the muscle thickness and kind of a global muscle mass quantity.
Yeah, I think for competitors that would be super interesting, especially if you have a series of case studies looking at, okay, hey, we have these, 7 female competitors. They all got very lean. They competed. And it'd be super interesting to see locally where they lost fat and how different I think they would be from one to the other, right? Because I've just seen, you've probably seen something similar where, like in females, like I had one competitor, she did her first show. She came to me like she was pretty lean already. Like her abs were very lean, but it took forever for her legs to get lean, and you'll see other competitors where it's just different. It just seems to be that, yeah, at some point you get lean enough, it'll come off, right? I mean, physics still works, but it's just interesting to see how different people react, even just locally different, which to me is oddly fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of like, how we store body fat too, right? Like
Right.
guys generally store it more in the stomach, and
Yep.
females in the hips and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's also interesting, and hopefully we can have, get enough of these case studies done where now we can start noticing some trends and
Right.
seeing like, okay, females are more prone to losing body fat here, and maybe takes the last 4 weeks or whatever to really start seeing changes in their legs. And then also looking, kind of correlating that to their nutrition approach in terms of, are they using refeeds or some periods of nutritional periodization? And does that help? Does it make a difference with hormones or body comp or anything, or does it do nothing? So looking at some of those things so that maybe we can start to get enough data to really start, applying it into certain strategies and practicalities.
Yeah, and for me, it would be super interesting to look at even heart rate variability or some marker of stress, because I have this theory, and it's not really backed up by much, that I think stress kind of throws in a weird monkey wrench that may change the location possibly. Again, there's not a lot of data on that. There's some old stuff on, cortisol goes up, higher stress, you tend to store more fat around your midsection. But it'd be interesting to see if, like you said, if there's other factors, certain nutritional programs, exercise modes. There's like some super old school data, I think, looking at, was it biking versus running, and possibly some differences with local fat deposition or not. I don't think that was ever really replicated again, but yeah, it'd be super interesting.
Yeah, and we did use a questionnaire, so obviously that's very subjective. It was,
Sure.
I think, stress perceived rating scale or something like that. But yeah, I think having more objective measure to measure stress and determine if they're storing or even like holding on to more water in their midsection, like that's a
Yep.
big one for competitors as well. Where's the water going? And if we have a good, BIS or BIA machine to detect where is it being stored, and if we see stress is higher, you're going to store more in the abdomen or midsection. I think that could be helpful. I think you can, you know, it's hard sometimes to like find a practical application for like, okay, if stress is high, how do we reduce it then, right? Like,
Right.
and when you're a competitor and you're getting that lean, there's a certain amount where it's like it's just going to be there. You can try to reduce it, but at some point, it's more of the interpretation of like that kind of that inverted U, right? Like a good amount of stress, but then too much. Now we're storing too much water. So that sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that in HRV scores, and I've done this with more than just a few female competitors where, they're getting pretty lean, but then they get all freaked out that they're storing a lot of water. You look at their HRV, it's real high, their calories are real low, their carbs are low, and I'm like, okay, so at your dinner, just have like 40 more grams of carbs. They're like, what? That's crazy. I'm going to get fat. Like, I'm like 4 weeks out. What are you doing, you idiot? I'm like, no, just trust me. It's even if you stored 100% of those carbohydrates as fat, you're still going to be fine, right? It's not going to make that much of a difference. And they're like, okay. And so they do it, and they get on the scale the next day. They're like, holy shit, I lost 2 pounds. And it's like you
Yeah.
didn't lose 2 pounds of fat, but because of the fluid difference, maybe related to stress, who knows? I'm not even 100% sure, but it seems to be that happens more often than not. And more or less, I'm just doing it not so much for the physiologic but the psychological thing to show them that, yeah, all these things do matter, and we do have something to do if this is the thing that may happen too. And also to realize that, okay, your scale weight was probably inflated by a couple pounds, so it's like you look at it a lot of times, you're like, oh my god, I'm not making any progress at all, and then they're like, oh, okay, I guess I am okay. It's like, yeah, we're good.
Yeah. And do you, with competitors, do you frequently use some type of refeed approach, whether it's a diet break or just a short 1 or 2 day increase in carbohydrates?
Yes and no. So most of the time I do, but at the same time, if they're consistent and everything is good, like the first thing I'll do is I'll just go what I call just like a flat macros approach, right? Because I
Yeah.
want them to be as consistently as possible. I want to see how their training affects it. I want to see how their HRV affects it. And then a lot of it is just based on what they report. Are they super hungry? Is it performance tanking? If they're already relatively low and I'm afraid of really just tanking their performance, then I might do like a zigzag method, right? So high day, low day, high day, low day. I've done like the Bill Campbell with 2 high days and then low to moderate days. I've done that a
Hmm.
fair amount. That seems to work pretty good. And then I'll bracket their like 2 heaviest full body sessions on the higher carbohydrate days. And again, like we could argue, is that psychological? Is it physiologic? I don't know, but that seems
Yeah.
to work pretty good. And then the thing I'm just looking at the whole time is like, I just don't want to run out of runway, and I don't want to stress the piss out of them, because it's
Yeah.
like in the past I goofed up. I had one competitor who was at like 3,800 calories or something. She was a smaller female in the off season, and I'm like, yeah, this prep's gonna be so easy. This is gonna be amazing. And then she starts cutting calories, and like, boom, she would adapt like immediately. And I'm like,
Hmm.
oh crap, So we had cut calories relatively aggressively, even though we started at a high point. And I'm like hitting myself in the face, going, oh, I'm an idiot. Like I was just focused on this high number. I totally forgot about the rate of adaptation, to it. So now I'm looking at, okay, how aggressive do we have to be? You have to hit X date. We know you want to average, whatever this, zero point 0.5 to 1 pound or whatever numbers you're using. And then I just watch their HRV. If we're already lower calories and their HRV is just showing that they're super stressed and it's like 16 weeks out. Oh, that's and you have to sit down and just be like, hey, here's what's going on. So it's, I don't know. I'm open to any feedback on it. I don't work with a ton of competitors, just, a few here and there, various, I would say, expertise. The benefit of working with more experienced competitors is that you have historical data to go on, and they're usually much more in tune with their body, right? So you can say, okay, hey, we're at about this level. Here's your stress. How you feeling? Okay, yeah, I feel pretty good. I've done 8 shows before, so I know I'm probably in a good spot. I'm like, all right, cool. If it's like the first couple shows or they haven't done a show for a long time, it's just so much harder because you're always kind of weighing these things out, right? Because I know the old school approach was, oh, just walk more, just get down to eating like friggin' lettuce per day and just shut up and do it. It's like, yeah, but they're real humans too, and at some point you can't just be hungry forever either and expect someone to not have a breakdown.
No, I agree. And I look at the same, I laugh because like I've had the same thing. I've had a female bikini competitor even this year now. She has had a really nice off-season calorie number, and I'm like, oh, she should, do fairly well. But I always preface it with like, you may be at a high calorie count right now, but once you start dieting, I don't know how you're going to respond. Yep. You could respond really well or not at all. And I ran into the same situation where it's like, man, we had to get calories pretty low for her to really start getting the fat loss rolling, especially towards the end. We had to get low. And you just can't keep going. And I'm with you on the refeed thing. Like, is it a physiological or psychological? I don't know. I mean, I think we need some more data to really, be confident in making either assumption. But it's like at a certain point, what are you going to do? Just keep starving them and starving them until they just are miserable and they can't even follow the diet, and then they don't compete and now they're really stressed. Like something's got to give. And so it's like, if they're really not responding well, I'll do the same thing. I'll try either 1 or 2 back-to-back days, and whether it's them de-stressing or just helping them kind of, I don't know, maybe performance in the gym. Regardless, it does seem to help for some people that may have a difficult time responding to the diet and seeing further weight loss. But that also, like, it also is one of those things where, do we have the time to implement some refeeds? I generally like to try to get some, short periods, 1 to 2 days, like you said, kind of a zigzag approach if we need to. And I have found with the competitors that I've worked with, if they're having a difficult time responding, I don't know what it is, a couple refeed days, and now they start hitting new low weigh-ins. So, is it a reduction in stress and therefore maybe, a way that their body is able to lose fat, or is it a physiological thing where, okay, now leptin's going up, which is a big theory behind having these refeed days, which really isn't supported too strongly, or is it some other physiological mechanism we just don't know about?
Yeah, the 2 big X factors I see a lot more coaches looking at now are lifestyle factors, especially stress, and then any amount of pain that they have. So to me, like in the off season, like my goal is to get your heart rate variability within reason pretty high and pretty good, right? And this may even be more aerobic work. We'll look at your VO2 max, we'll look at a bunch of other stuff. And ideally, like very little to no mechanical pain at all. Even like any little niggly issues you had, to me, I want to have those be resolved as close as possible, because I think we underestimate how much being in a severe caloric restriction is just a massive stressor, and if your life is a shit show and you've got 800 things, going on, and you've got all these weird niggly issues, you can do it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I've had clients do it and they've been successful, so it's not an all or nothing thing by any stretch of the imagination. But ooh, it just makes me nervous.
Yeah, I know. I'm in the same boat. I get like nervous for them because I know like that dark place that some people have to go to like see further weight loss. And the thing I always remind myself is like I'm not coaching Olympia physique competitors. These
Right.
are, people that do it for a hobby. They have jobs, they have families, they have
They have
kids.
a
Do you want
life.
to make this yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to make this person miserable in their daily life as well? Because it all trickles over. I mean, I've dieted one time in my life for a competitive season, and my wife will say that I was not a happy camper during that time. So it's like, you don't want their other lifestyle factors to really change that much, or at least be that impacted as well. So it's like, you can only run somebody into the ground for so long, and you've got to come up with some other strategies, I think. And refeeds I have found have been helpful for some, and
Yeah.
they've also done nothing for others. I have seen if I have a bikini competitor, or even a male, bodybuilder who is getting pretty low and they haven't been responding anymore, we've tried refeeds and they haven't done much. So it's like you said, it's not an all or nothing approach, but I think for some it can help. It's like the high, individual differences between people. It's the same thing with how they respond to certain approaches. Some it works for and some it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember talking to Eric Helms about this too, and he's like, "Oh, you mean competitive starvation?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's a good way of phrasing it." He's like, "Yeah." He's like, even when I get super low on calories, I remember giving a lecture once. He's like, where I was holding onto the board, and he's like, you even like blink slowly, And even if you've been around people who've competed, another good buddy of mine, he was maybe 3 weeks out, I think, from a show, and I was doing a presentation on RPR, reflexive performance reset, and he came and he was there the whole time, and he came up at first and he apologized. He's like, "Hey man, I just want to let you know I'm like 3 weeks out, and if I look like I'm not paying attention, that's why." I was like, "Wow, that's impressive. You even showed up, man. That's crazy."
Yeah. I mean, you can get people, even if they're having trouble losing weight, like you said, the physics still apply. Like you can
Yeah,
starve somebody enough and they're gonna lose weight, but how miserable do you want them to be? And how do you, like, some people, their jobs require high, functioning
yeah.
capacity, and you just can't take that away from them as well. So it's
And how much muscle are you going to lose too? I mean, you
right.
start losing performance. The first thing I think about is, oh crap, like your body doesn't have a reason now to hold on to muscle, right? And
Hmm.
it doesn't matter really where their performance was, but if you see that, again, 16 weeks out and their performance is just dropping like a rock, it's like, oh, that's not good, right? Because you're
Yeah.
removing that stimulus, especially in a caloric deficit, the one thing they have to keep and hold on to muscle. If you start
Hmm.
losing performance, that makes me nervous too.
Yeah, and that's, one thing I've done, and I don't know, I'd love to hear your approach as well with, getting deep in a prep and maybe under 5 weeks, maybe under 4 weeks when, they're struggling mentally, physically, they're getting lean, but they're also seeing, some decreases in performance. Something I often do is I will bring rep ranges a little bit lower. And I've seen this help with some people. Others, it may make a difference, maybe not. But bringing rep ranges, like if they were doing, let's say, 12 to 15 reps on an exercise, bringing that maybe down to 8 to 10. And my theory behind it is if they're storing less muscle glycogen, at least they can sustain it for a relatively shorter amount of time rather than doing 12 to 15 reps and just being run into the ground, maybe 6 to 8 or 8 to 10, and they can still have that mechanical tension with an increase in weight, maybe. But yeah, I'd love to hear if you do anything like that. I have noticed that people seem to be less run into the ground. Maybe stress is a little bit less because of you're not just training until they're burnt out too.
Yeah, I'm probably one of those weirdos where for probably the last 3-ish years now, I tend to go towards that more. It's a
Hmm.
weird, I don't know where this ever came from, but like in bodybuilding, people are like, "Oh, bro, you got to do 15 to 20 reps on the leg press to, burn in those cuts," and all this weird shit you hear all the time.
Yeah.
But like, man, if you are super low on carbohydrates, like doing high rep squats, deadlifts, leg press, whatever. It's miserable enough as it is, but to be that depleted and then do it,
Right.
I've just seen it just an HRV scores just torch people. And in my head, I'm thinking, wait a minute, like we're really probably not getting as much hypertrophy right now. We're just trying to hold on to as much lean body mass as possible. Am I going to have a limited amount of energy? Like, how am I going to spend it? Do I really think doing extended drop sets of 15 to 20 reps pre-contest is a good idea? Like, I don't think so. I would much rather, especially for natural competitors, err on doing heavier load, because to me that's a bigger stimulus to just hold on to more tissue, just because you literally have more stress, more mechanical tension. And I find, like what you said too, is that it's hard, but it's not as bad. And I think that's because you're probably not running as big of oxygen debt. You're not probably burning through as much glycogen, etc.
Yeah, and that's what I found to be helpful. And again, not in everybody.
Yeah, there's individual differences, but
but I find that the majority of the time, bringing their rep ranges just a little bit lower will help in that later stage of prep where they're already burnt out and run down. And the goal, like you said, it's not to build muscle or increase muscle. We're just trying to hold on to every little bit we can if we're lucky. So, and natural competitors, right? You may see some of these IFBB guys and girls, doing crazy shit with towards the end of their prep to really get the definition they think that they're maybe getting, but they're also enhanced. So it's a much different story.
Yeah. And I've often even wondered about, I even try to avoid muscle damage if at all possible, even like a few weeks out, because and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too. It's like, it's harder to recover from. I think the risk reward is not favorable, because I think you potentially run into other issues with even just like local inflammation and other stuff where their appearance just doesn't look as good compared to someone who just kind of coasts into a show just doing relatively easier but still heavier work versus trying to brutalize them 2 weeks out. That always just seemed to backfire on me.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you can avoid that, really, and soreness isn't always
not the best indicator.
No, it's not, but it's generally associated with muscle damage, usually not always though. But if they're getting sore all the time, then yeah, and trying new exercises would be another way where if you're switching up exercise, you're going to get more damage theoretically, not always. But if you can avoid that, I agree. I think the inflammation factor goes up. So, they may even lose some definition just because they're more swelled. Right. And then also the stress response with that as well. Like now they're going to be more stressed out. Cortisol, I'm assuming, would go up if there's more muscle damage. I don't know that for sure, but I would assume so. If you can avoid muscle damage at any cost, like I think that would definitely help as well. It's just more about managing things so that fatigue doesn't run extremely high, which would lead to more stress, which would just lead to more water retention in the wrong places, I think.
Yeah, and it's kind of like any athletes. I mean, before competition, like I just spend most of my time, and I'm sure you're similar, just trying to talk them out of the craziest shit known to man. And like everyone, a lot of people I work with are actually coaches too, and I've ran into this before, just in some of the novice competitions I've done before. I find myself going, oh, maybe I should try 400 milligrams of caffeine. I've only tried 300. Like, whoa, wait a minute. Like you catch yourself, hopefully, not all the time. But it's just like I spend more time trying to talk people out of stuff. Like, no, let's just do something what we've done before. We've tested this. Let's just keep it easy. Let's not do anything new. Let's not make any radical changes. Just keep everything. Everything looks good. We don't need to do anything different.
Yeah, it's almost like
it's anticlimactic because they're waiting for you to pull out like the super secret, crazy Russian squirrel protocol and.
Right. It's like, now here's this magic thing that's going to put it all together and you're going to feel and look amazing. Right. And it's just like, you're just managing their stress at a certain point for them. It's almost like you're their therapist in a way. But Yeah, and I think part of it is like they're so dieted, they're so lean, and now their mind just starts playing tricks on them, right? Like especially as a bodybuilder, you're so focused on the vanity aspect because you're focused with the body composition. So it's like now your mind just starts playing tricks on you, and you get these inner voices that are just telling you the opposite of what you are actually maybe going through. And so as a coach, I think a big portion of the coaching aspect is just managing their stress and their behaviors and just trying to talk them off the ledge most of the time.
Yeah, and even a lot of times with if they're sending in pictures and stuff, I I'm not the best at looking at pictures and noticing these different changes. I'm not a judge. I don't work with a ton of physique competitors, so even then, a lot of times I have friends who have been doing it, all the time and are judges for shows. So I'll just take their pictures and send them to them and be like, "Hey, what do you think?" Because I also know that if I've been working with someone for like 2 years and this is their first show, I'm probably even not going to see stuff because I'm so biased into wanting them to succeed. So I even like to check myself sometimes on that. And I'll tell them like, "Hey, I sent your photos to these 3 other people. I'm not telling you who they are. Here's feedback from person 1, person 2, person 3." And that makes me feel a little bit better, one, that I'm not missing anything, and whether it's my own bias or just, education, etc. And then I also kind of want to, it's so personal at that point, I almost want to pull myself out of the loop from some feedback to make sure it's legitimate feedback based on almost an external source.
Yeah, that's a great approach, and that's one that I haven't. I mean, I've done it with, um, when I was working for another coach, coaching. We've looked at our competitor photos together, but that's something that I definitely haven't done enough of. I think that's a great way to do it because you get, you can be your own worst critic, even as a
Totally.
coach, like looking at one of your competitors and just wanting them to look a certain way and start changing your perception and subjective outlook of that physique. So I think getting some outside feedback is so valuable and something I'm definitely going to do more of just now because of you saying that. I think it's very valuable for sure.
Cool. And briefly, I wanted to touch on some of the research. You had talked about a new research study we were talking about that was higher carbs, lower fat approach, correct?
Oh yeah, the Ludwig study that was recently kind of a criticism of Kevin Hall's study. Do you remember the obese or not the obesity? Yeah, it was in the obesity energetics where Kevin Hall did a meta-analysis on like low carb, low fat.
Yep.
And so Ludwig came out with a kind of a criticism of that and included some other studies in a new meta-analysis. And so they found that, that low fat um, or high fat diets are better for metabolic rate purposes, but they also use doubly labeled water. Did you ever use doubly labeled water when you're doing?
No, we didn't have it at our facility at all, but it's pretty
Okay.
fascinating. It's kind of an old school approach, but if you're looking at free living subjects, like I don't know of a better method. And again, all methods have their pros and cons.
Hmm. Yeah, and so what they did is they really kind of placed their interpretation of high carb, low fat diets on doubly labeled water. But the problem is like this was in studies that use metabolic ward data. And so
Hmm.
it was a lot of studies that use both. They use doubly labeled water and metabolic ward data. And so they really predicated, they actually stratified the studies in terms of short and long duration studies. I forget what the cutoff was off the top of my head, but the shorter duration studies seem to have a bias towards the high fat and the kind of keto groups. But the problem is most of them were using doubly labeled water. And I know Kevin Hall actually, I don't know if it's been published yet. I think it's like a preprint. I got it off of his ResearchGate. And it was showing that doubly labeled water can actually over predict energy expenditure in diets that are heavily weighted in low fat or low carb or high fat, high carb.
Hmm.
So when you have diets that are very widely different in the ratios of carbs to fat, you can get this kind of, I guess, transient increase in energy expenditure, which may seem like it's a change in energy expenditure, but it's really just how that measure or how doubly labeled water is measuring energy expenditure. And I mean, I don't fully understand how it works. When you talk about it on like a cellular level with like lipo or gluconeogenesis and like all these other, pathways. But yeah, it was really interesting to read the Ludwig study and then just do some background research and kind of get into that literature a little bit with like doubly labeled water and calorimetry and stuff. That stuff is just it's one of those things where it's almost hard to interpret, kind of like looking into space and trying to comprehend the universe. It's just it gets crazy.
Yeah, hasn't now I have to look, but someone must have done this study where you take subjects and you do doubly labeled water and then you put them in a metabolic chamber.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because wouldn't that
Yes.
give you a way of comparing the two methods in each individual?
Yes, and it is good. It is a good measure, but the problem is those studies have been used with a balanced diet. So
Right, and if you change
you
that,
have
then
a
that's a different thing. Yeah.
yes, and there is some data. I think Kevin Hall in this preprint, he put in there some of their data from a study that did that, where they looked at whole room calorimetry and doubly labeled water, and those that had this crazy distribution of fats to carb ratios had a transient increase in doubly
Mm.
labeled water energy expenditure. So it's tough because it's like you have these studies come out that show a benefit to one strategy versus another, but then you kind of dig into the methods and how are we quantifying certain things and how are we defining certain things. And it opens up a whole can of worms for everybody's interpretations to be different and their own, and they're biased in them. So it can be hard, especially as somebody who's maybe reading research and trying to increase their knowledge. It's hard for them to really decipher, okay, what's right, what's wrong, what's fact, and what's interpretation.
Yeah, and I have a little bit of doubt, so it's not based on a whole bunch of stuff that if you're using indirect calorimetry, right, or metabolic cart, however that is, on an individual basis with a mask or in a room, however your setup is,
Mm-hmm.
if you're really hard into ketosis, I don't know how much I trust indirect calorimetry at that point. There's some
Yeah.
earlier work showing that it may not be the best because of the amount of energy that you are then running through ketones, which are then kind of using a slightly different pathway. And the only thing you're really looking at is oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide going out.
Right.
Not to say that physics are invalid, but I think that kind of sort of invalidates a few of the the 7 or 8 assumptions that go into using that method too. But yeah, I don't have anything to base that on per se, but yeah, then researchers who do that yell at me all the time. So
Yeah. Well, and the thing with indirect calorimetry too, especially if you're looking at like doubly labeled water, it's heavily weighted on RQ. And,
Yep.
when you're looking at like parvo machine or like resting metabolic rate and breath analysis, like RQ is just all over the place. And I know me and you have talked about this
Mm-hmm.
before, where it's just, it doesn't tell you much of anything except for maybe what that person ate a day ago in terms of like, did they have more carbs or fats? And so if you're looking at a measure that's really heavily based on something that's really kind of all over the place, it's hard to be that, confident in the results of a study that uses it. And again, they have good agreement, but when you're going to really start getting into the nitty gritty of things, like you kind of got to look at some of these more controlled experiments to get an idea of what might be happening.
Yeah, and I've thought for a while, because even looking at RMR, looking at RQ or RER, right? So for people listening, that's the
Yeah.
percentage of fat to percentage of carbohydrate. It seems to be quite variable, and I don't know if that's because the system is more or less not as balanced at rest. But I've noticed if I apply just like a very small amount of exercise, like get on a bike and just do 50 watts, right? So just a warm up, I've often wondered if that would be a more useful measure if we're looking at fuel usage comparing a wide group of people, right? So applying just a little bit of exercise to try to stabilize the system at whatever range it's going to be at. It just seems like that's a little bit more reproducible than a completely, at rest measurement that appears to be more sensitive to other factors. But again, no literature on
Yeah.
that either. So
Yeah. No, I mean that's great in theory, though. I think it makes some logical sense, but you know, when you start putting those things to the test, it tends to throw a wrench in your spokes, so to speak.
Oh, totally. Because now, even if that's true, which again, we don't have data to say that it is true, then okay, so now we do a resting RMR, and now we got to do another test to try to look at fuel usage. And then obviously I'm biased because my PhD work was looking at low levels of exercise and then looking at the variability in RER. And we have some preliminary
Right.
data, a couple studies showing that if it's more variable, so this fine scale variability, that may be a marker for metabolic flexibility. So you have like the
Mm,
average of the number, and then you've got how much that number kind of moves around a little bit during steady state exercise, right? Just like how much heart rate moves around a little bit during rest is heart rate
mm,
variability. So you can
right.
look at some other variability measurements to try to maybe quantify what's going on with the system too.
Yeah, almost taking just the averages of the changes that are occurring. It's like body weights, you know, fluctuating day to day and looking at a 7 day average to really see how much do you fluctuate on average normally and then comparing that.
Yeah, and I've done that anecdotally too with body weight for years where like if someone is stuck, like literally their body weight will be almost the same within like less than half a pound per day most of the time. And so what I've done then is I'm like I'll give them like a very high caloric day and it'll go up by like half a pound or 1 pound and then they start losing again. And it's almost like
Mm,
you need to sometimes inject more variability into the system first to get it moving again. Because it was like, I tell clients, it's like if you're in Minnesota and the car gets stuck in the snowbank, right? You can push it really hard, or do you actually try to generate momentum by rocking the car and
right.
allowing it to paradoxically go backwards a little bit, to kind of get it out and get it moving again? So,
Yeah, yeah, I think that's interesting. And you can even go into like some of those, like adding, this is a bit different because we're talking about, you know, calories and you know, energy consumption and utilization, but you know, like the sensors that we have, like
right.
mechanoreceptors we have in our body that sense artificial weight or even just load from lifting, like just changing that, can that cause an influx in the rate of muscle growth or the rate of weight loss if you're adding artificial weight to your body? Yeah, I think maybe just trying to disrupt, like purposefully trying to disrupt the system could elicit a change is an interesting idea.
Yeah, I asked Stu Phillips that question years ago. I'm like, if we chuck people into outer space and we know without any countermeasures they lose muscle mass and bone real fast, can we stick people in like hypergravity on Earth to accelerate gains? And he kind of
Right.
thought about it for a while. And he didn't say I was crazy. He's like, all right, I said, or is the system just asymmetric to begin with, meaning that no matter what stimulus, you're going to hit a max, and the more stimulus isn't going to create greater growth. And that's he was kind of more on that. That at some point, once you triggered it, you can't trigger it more, right? That it's just going to
Right.
top out at whatever that max rate is, which we probably don't know. So
Yeah. Yeah, the body is a fascinating machine.
yeah,
It's
yeah. Super cool. Well, thank you so much for all your time. I really appreciate it. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, you guys can follow me on Instagram at Jaymes Longstrom. I am on Facebook, but I'm really not active. Hopefully, I'll pick that up as well. And then we also have a Team Biolayne page that I'm pretty active on as well. And yeah, if you have any general questions or you know you want to shoot me an email, you can do that. It's James Jaymes at biolayne.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we'll hope to talk to you soon again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Mike. It's my pleasure. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. As always, really appreciate it. Big thanks to James for his time coming on the podcast. I highly recommend checking out his stuff. He's got really great stuff on his Instagram account too. Research-based actionable items you can do for performance and body comp. As always, this is brought to you by the Flex Diet Certification. It will go on sale again July 19th, which is a Monday, 2021, and it'll be open until July 26th, 2021. So it'll be open for 7 days this quarter. Go to flexdiet.com if you're looking for a way to improve body composition and performance, all without destroying your health in the process. I walk you through 8 different interventions, and we have the big picture so you understand context, a detailed technical primer, which we have made understandable, but we do go pretty deep into some of the research there, and then 5 action items for each one. So at the end of the certification, you'll have a total of 40 specific action items, and each in the 8 area. There's 5 in each of the 8 areas. In addition, we've got expert interviews from all sorts of people from the industry. Dr. Dan Party, Dr. Stu Phillips, Dr. Jose Antonio, both those guys talking about protein. Dr. Eric Helms talking about flexible dieting, and even Dr. Stefan Guillenet talking about how your brain regulates appetite, and we even got more expert interviews than that. So check it out. Go to flexdiet.com, flexdiet.com, and you can get onto the wait list there in the upper right-hand corner. If it is during the launch, that'll take you directly to the sales page for more information. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you listening. Take care.